For generations, if you grew up in certain parts of Georgia, there was one word used as a threat, a whisper meant to keep children in line: Milledgeville. This is the reason why. Welcome to Central State Hospital, which at its peak during the 1960s was the largest mental institution in the United States. More than 12,000 patients once lived here on a campus spanning nearly 2,000 acres. It wasn't simply a hospital. It was an entire city. Today we're driving through what was once called the City of the Sick. But what we found wasn't just an abandoned hospital. It was the story of thousands of people who slowly disappeared from the world, long before they ever disappeared from history. Today's plan isn't to wander around looking for abandoned buildings. We're following Central State Hospital's official self-guided driving tour to understand how a place founded with compassion slowly became one of America's most complicated chapters in mental health history. Before beginning the tour, we stopped at the Central State Hospital Museum located inside the old train depot. It may be a small museum, but some of the most meaningful moments from our visit happened inside these walls. We spent quite a while talking with the museum curator, who had recently published a book called Seeking Asylum. After returning home, I bought a copy and read it cover to cover. That eventually led me to another fascinating book called Administrations of Lunacy, Racism, and the Haunting of American Psychiatry at the Milledgeville Asylum. Together, they gave me a much deeper understanding of this place than a single afternoon ever could. One of my favorite parts of traveling is meeting the people who dedicate themselves to preserving local history. History doesn't survive on its own. It survives because someone chooses to remember it. Then something unexpected happened. As Dusty looked through one of the exhibits, she discovered paperwork connected to one of her own ancestors. Moments like that always amaze me. You travel somewhere hoping to learn someone else's story, and suddenly history becomes personal. Armed with the museum's driving guide and audio tour, we headed out onto the campus. The first thing that struck me wasn't fear. It was scale. This isn't a hospital. It's an entire town with its own power plant, fire department, farms, water system, railroad access, and hundreds of buildings spread across rolling hills. Even driving through the campus felt different than I expected. It wasn't eerie. It was quiet, almost respectfully quiet. Our drive begins beneath the beautiful pecan trees lining the entrance roads. It's almost impossible to reconcile this peaceful setting with the stories these grounds would eventually hold. Central State Hospital opened in 1842 as the Georgia State Lunatic, Idiot, and Epileptic Asylum. While the name sounds jarring today, its founding actually represented a remarkably progressive idea for the time. Instead of housing people with mental illness in jails or poorhouses, Georgia wanted to create a place devoted to treatment and care. The hospital's first superintendent, Dr. Thomas Green, believed deeply in what became known as the institution as family. He shared meals with patients and staff, encouraged dignity, and eliminated many of the chains and physical restraints commonly used in psychiatric hospitals during that era. For a brief time, there was genuine optimism. Driving past these old buildings, it's easy to imagine what people hoped this place might become. But that hope slowly began to erode. As Georgia's population grew, so did Central State's patient population. Soon it wasn't only treating those experiencing severe mental illness. Communities began sending anyone they couldn't or wouldn't care for themselves. The poor, the elderly, people with developmental disabilities, women labeled difficult, individuals admitted for reasons that today sound almost unimaginable, including religious excitement, laziness, or simply ill-treated by husband. By the middle of the 20th century, the hospital wasn't failing because every doctor or nurse lacked compassion. It was failing because thousands of people were being cared for by a system that had never been designed to hold so many lives. By the 1960s, more than 12,000 patients lived here, making Central State the largest mental institution in America. To truly understand Central State, you have to step inside the museum. This isn't simply a collection of old artifacts. It's an attempt to restore the humanity of the people who lived here. What struck me most wasn't the medical equipment. It wasn't even the restraint devices or hydrotherapy equipment. It was the faces. The photographs aren't difficult because they're old. They're difficult because every face belonged to someone who once had a family. Someone who laughed. Someone who dreamed about a future. Someone whose entire identity eventually became patient. The museum doesn't shy away from the darker chapters. It discusses overcrowding, outdated medical practices, hydrotherapy, insulin shock therapy, and lobotomies, not as sensational stories, but as reminders of how desperately medicine searched for answers before truly understanding mental illness. Many of those treatments permanently changed lives, often stripping away much of the personality that made someone who they were. The exhibits also confront another painful truth. For much of its history, Central State Hospital operated within a segregated South. Black patients were housed separately in facilities that were often overcrowded and under-resourced. The cemeteries themselves reflected those same divisions. Reading more about this after returning home gave me a greater appreciation for just how complicated this story really is. It would be easy to paint Central State as simply good or evil. History is rarely that simple. The hospital began with compassion. Many doctors, nurses, attendants, and caregivers genuinely wanted to help. But overcrowding, underfunding, segregation, changing medical theories, and society's fear of mental illness slowly transformed that original mission into something very different. That's why places like this matter. Not because they give us someone to blame, but because they remind us how easily good intentions can drift away from the ideals that created them. Perhaps the most moving exhibit of all is the patient artwork. Each painting, each carving, each handwritten note quietly reminds us that every statistic represented an individual life. If you've been enjoying exploring forgotten places and the stories they still have to tell, I'd love to have you along for future adventures. Subscribing helps support our mission of preserving local history, sharing overlooked places, and reminding people that behind every historic site are real human lives worth remembering. Now let's continue the drive. Leaving the museum, the history feels heavier. Our next stop is the Powell building. The original Asylum completed in 1842. Its grand columns still command attention. Even now, the architecture almost dares you to imagine what people once hoped this institution could become. Local tradition says General Sherman's troop camped nearby during the march to the sea while sparing the building itself. Whether standing as a hospital, an administrative center, or now an aging landmark, the Powell building has quietly witnessed nearly 2 centuries of Georgia history. Driving these roads, it's impossible not to picture what they once looked like. These lawns where college students now walk were once exercise yards for hundreds of patients. These sidewalks carried physicians, nurses, visitors, and families saying heartbreaking goodbyes. I've visited a lot of abandoned places over the years. Very few have ever felt this heavy. Further along stands the massive Jones Building, completed in 1929. Its enclosed porches and imposing design quietly reveal how architecture itself became part of treatment and sometimes confinement. It's impossible not to wonder what the view looked like from those windows, what hopes remained, what letters were written, what conversations were never finished. A rusted fire escape, a boarded doorway, the faded outline of an old sign. Each feels less like decay and more like a scar. Our final stop is perhaps the most sobering place on the entire campus, the patient cemeteries. There isn't just one cemetery here. There are several, including separate burial grounds created during segregation. Together, it's estimated that more than 25,000 patients are buried on these grounds. Standing here, that number is almost impossible to comprehend. Many graves are marked only with small numbered markers. For decades, patients who died without family claiming them were buried under those numbers. Not because they lacked names, but because somewhere along the way, their stories became difficult to find. In one of the saddest chapters of the cemetery's history, many of those numbered markers were reportedly removed during grounds maintenance, leaving the precise locations of countless graves uncertain. Thankfully, dedicated volunteers, historians, descendants, and preservation groups have worked tirelessly to restore dignity to these cemeteries and reconnect names with the people who lived them. Standing here is incredibly moving, not because it's frightening, because it's profoundly human. Driving away from Central State Hospital, I realized I wasn't leaving with ghost stories. I was leaving with questions. How do good intentions become broken systems? How do thousands of people slowly become invisible? And what responsibility do we have to remember them now? History has a way of reducing people to numbers, a patient number, a census record, a numbered grave marker. But every one of those numbers belonged to someone who laughed, loved, dreamed, struggled, and mattered. Travel isn't only about seeing beautiful places. Sometimes it's about standing where difficult stories unfolded, listening, learning, and carrying those stories forward. Because maybe the greatest kindness we can offer the forgotten is simply refusing to forget them.